So before we see what Frege's argument for senses is, I want to talk to you first about a different principle called the Principle of Compositionality. This is actually implicitly involved in Frege's arguments, so his argument relies on this principle, even though he doesn't explicitly talk about it, nor does he ever call anything the Principle of Compositionality. This name, the Principle of Compositionality, this is something philosophers much later introduced into philosophy of language. But it's kind of a testament to Frege's foresight that even at this early stage, he's basically relying on this principle. And to better understand the argument that he gives, it's going to be easier for us to explicitly say what that principle is before we go on to see exactly why Frege thinks there's sense as well as reference. So as usual, the way that we're going to try and get a grip on compositionality is through some examples. What compositionality really tells us is it tells us something about the circumstances under which sentences mean the same thing or under which they mean different things. So to get a sense of what that really amounts to, it's going to be helpful to look at some examples of sentences which mean the same and some examples of sentences which mean different things. So let's start first with a pair of examples which mean the same thing. So here's one sentence: John is a bachelor. And here's another: John is an unmarried man. So clearly these sentences mean the same thing. If you were to ask, for instance, the question, is John married? I could say either in response. I could say John is a bachelor, or I could say John is an unmarried man. And both of my answers would say exactly the same thing. But let's now ask ourselves, why do these sentences mean the same thing? And it's pretty clear that it has something to do with the meanings of the words in the sentences. So for instance, we notice first of all that the first three words are basically the same. The difference between and is unimportant. So these three things mean the same because they're just the same words. And then crucially, the last expression, even though they're different expressions, they're different words, they mean the same thing. Bachelor just means unmarried man. With the result that, well, since all the words mean the same thing and they're put together in the same way, the sentences as a whole mean the same things. So what this example illustrates is that if you take two sentences which are put together with words that mean the same things, then the sentence as a whole is going to have to mean the same thing, as long as the words are put together in the same way. We'll come back to that in a minute. So in some sense, the meanings of sentences are built out of the meanings of their parts. We see this because if we use words which mean the same things and combine them in the same ways, we get sentences which mean the same things. That's what happened here. We use words which mean the same things, we combine them in the same way, and we saw the resulting sentences mean the same thing. Compositionality also tells us something, though, about what happens when sentences mean different things. So let's take one more example. Let's say John is a professor. Now clearly, 1 and 2 and 3 now mean different things. So 1 and 2 still mean the same, but 3 says something very different to the other two. What compositionality tells us is that, well, since sentence 3 means something different from sentences 1 and 2, it must contain some word that means something different from any of the words in the other sentences. And again, because I chose the example in this particular way, the answer is obvious. So this word professor, clearly this means something different from any of the words in any of the other sentences. So again, compositionality says that sentences are built up out of the meanings of their words and the way that they're put together. And that means that if we find some sentences that differ in their meanings, we know that that difference must be traceable to some difference in the meanings of the words used. Because if all the words had the same meanings and they were put together in the same way, the sentences would mean the same thing. Since they don't, in this case, the difference must be traceable to some difference in the meanings of the words involved. So that's the general idea of compositionality, that the meaning of the sentence is determined by the meanings of the words in the sentence, along with the way that they're put together. Just as an exercise for you guys, because I didn't really explain the as they're put together point, I want you to think about why that would be important. So I could have given you a slightly different principle, which said that whenever two sentences contain words which mean the same thing, then the sentences mean the same thing. What I actually said added the qualification that the words have to be put together in the same way. Why is it important that they have to be put together in the same way? That's something I'd like you guys to think about, and that we'll talk about on Thursday. But for now, we've explained the compositionality principle. Now, it might seem to you that we're laboring over something kind of obvious. You might think, well, like, isn't it just totally obvious that the meanings of sentences are built out of the meanings of their words? And in a sense, it is kind of obvious, or at least very few people deny the principle of compositionality, except in maybe a few edge cases. But the reason it's going to be important is, one, it's just going to make things much clearer when we start talking about Frege's argument. But two, as we go on through the semester, we're going to see that this idea of compositionality is actually something fundamentally important in human language. Compositionality is this very, very special property, and language is sort of exceptional in the fact that it has compositionality. And thinking about Frege is going to be one example of this in some way. You can actually draw some surprising conclusions out of the compositionality principle, along with some other observations.